This evening, the City of Melbourne is delighted to be working with the United Nations Association Australia's Victorian Division, the UNAA, on the development of tonight's event. And I'm especially pleased, as part of tonight, that you'll be able to learn a little bit more about something that's been drafted called the Melbourne Declaration as we lead up to Rio in June. Over the past 12 months or so, the UNAA has facilitated a series of forums called the Earth Summit Series, and it's been a privilege for me to be part of those as a lead-up to Rio+20. Now, those forums have been focused on the concept of natural capital, urban infrastructure, energy, and social change, all in the context of the green economy, the theme, or one of the themes of this year's Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. Now, the Melbourne Declaration is on the UNAA website, and it's there for you to comment on. We'll hear a little bit more about it from Councillor Cathy Oak in a few moments. It's there for you to comment on. At this stage, it's an aspirational document designed to be discussed and finessed over the next weeks for its journey to Rio in June. And we would like to have your comments by the end of March for that. And at Rio, we hope to be able to present Victoria's thoughts, compare them to the thoughts of other groups, and bring that all back to Melbourne for further discussion and completion. The City of Melbourne also wants to acknowledge the support and work of future leaders tonight and the Auty team, whom we'll be hearing from as well. So thanks to them for their support and presence here tonight. To start off the evening, though, I'd like to welcome to the stage the City of Melbourne's Councillor Cathy Oak. I've known Cathy for how long now, Kath? A long time. We won't talk about that. Cathy plays a number of roles here in the sort of environment and sustainability space. She chairs a couple of the Future Melbourne committees, co-chair of the Parks and Gardens Advisory Committee, also the chair of the ICLEI Oceania Board, and on the Board of Directors for Tipping Point Australia, which sounds fascinating, and she'll be representing ICLEI at the Earth Summit in Rio in June. Please make her welcome.
Thank you, Rob. What a great facilitator for tonight's event. I would like to first begin by acknowledging that we're meeting here on the traditional land of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders, both past and present. I would like to also acknowledge our panellists, our fabulous panellists tonight. What a great list of speakers we're going to hear from tonight. I'd like to thank representatives from the United Nations Association of Australia, the Victoria Division. I think you're all in the row there. And for future leaders, of course, as well, and the founder and director, Dr. Helen Sykes. I'd like to acknowledge Auty, and they're up on the mezzanine, as Rob mentioned. I'd like to acknowledge you. We had an overwhelming response to tonight's conversation, so thank you for RSVPing and coming along, and it's great to see such a large audience. And I would like to thank you in advance for taking part in the hot seat component of tonight's discussion, which Rob will tell you more about later. So tonight's event is one of many that cities like us and organisations like the UNAA are holding across the world in the lead up to Rio+20. And Rio+20 is going to be like the 20-year high school reunion. It's the Earth Summit reunion from 1992. There'll be much reflection, probably much of it negative perhaps, about where have we got to on sustainable development goals, what has been achieved, what should have been achieved, what needs to be done to get back on track. And I think Rob will go into further detail around the key themes around green economy and governance and financial reform. I'd like to thank Geoff Taylor very much so for tonight, who runs the Melbourne Conversations, for allowing myself, our sustainability team, the EcoCity team, for allowing us to take over one of the Melbourne Conversations to help us develop the City of Melbourne's response to Rio+20. And we're calling it our Mapping Our Eco-City Story project. And over the last couple of weekends at the Sustainable Living Festival tonight, and in future conversations, we've been capturing people's stories about initiatives, ideas, projects, programs, great things that are going on in the City of Melbourne around sustainability, as well as their ideas of what we should be doing to ensure that in 20 years' time we really are an eco-city. So tonight we are capturing your stories and ideas, and our say will be doing that at the back of the room as well, and creating this interactive map that we look forward to taking as the city's response to that reflection that will be going on at Rio. And the ICLEI contingent is coordinating a global town hall, so there'll be cities from all around the world getting together and doing a very similar thing. But it started as a great process last year around reflecting on what the city's been doing to become an eco-city. And Geoff Lawler will be talking a bit more when he has the chair as one of the panellists. But it was a great conversation about what have we done in the last 20 years? How have we responded to the needs around sustainable development, economic, environment and social development as well. So it was a great project, and we look forward to sharing that timeline process with you tonight as well. I would also like to thank Melbourne Conversations for allowing the UNAA to also launch their draft Melbourne Declaration. It is online, and there is a link on the flyer that's on your chair tonight. And so really do take the time to have a look at their draft document and send them. I believe it's a bit interactive, and you'll be able to share your reflections and your ideas on that declaration, and hopefully at the end, when it's finalised, you'll be able to sign up and support it if that's what you'd like to do as well. So that's a great part about tonight, is that we've got together, the UNAA, the City of Melbourne, we're both working towards making sure that our contribution at the Rio+20 Earth Summit is valuable and worthwhile, not only to our organisations but to our community, and that's who you are tonight as well. So I know that Rob will be asking lots of questions tonight, and you'll have plenty of questions for the panellists, but I would like to leave you with some of the questions I have been asking people in our capturing the videos and getting post-it notes stuck onto our map of Melbourne at the various festivals we've been at. And I'll leave you with some of those questions, so hopefully that will start the process for tonight, and also after the event with the Auty website. So the questions we've been asking are: what sustainability goals has Melbourne achieved? Can we truly call ourselves an eco-city? What are the signs of progress? How far have we got to go? What changes have you noticed in Melbourne over the last 20 years? And if in 20 years' time you reflected back on the city as a true eco-city, what is it that we did today or tomorrow to ensure that we got there? So I thank you very much again for attending. Thank you to the panellists, and I'll hand you back to Rob.
Thanks, Kathy, we might have to put you in the hot seat later. What do you think? Can I first ask our panellists to come up and take their seats? It'll be easier if we do that now. I'll introduce them more formally in just a moment. If you all come up and liberally spread yourselves around the 7 chairs that are there. As Kathy mentioned, we have 5 panellists tonight. Very diverse group they are, and I'll introduce them in a moment or two. I'm going to introduce the Auty team at about 7 o'clock, and they're going to officially launch what they're doing, so you'll learn more about that. As I say, we've got 5 panellists and 7 chairs. I think one's for me later when we have a conversation, but the 6th, as Kathy introduced, is for you to take the hot seat in our question and answer session, which will be in the second half of this evening's program. So if you'd like to do that, you might let someone know so that we can find you quickly. But the idea is really for you to come out and share with the panel at close range, as it were, your opinions, ideas, thoughts. Make a statement if you wish, but we would ask you to keep your question as well brief, so that we can have as many people up here as possible. We'll also be taking questions from the floor, so you're not compelled to come and sit in the hot seat. But we had a good idea that since this is a Melbourne conversation, that it's a good thing for you to come up and actually present that question or your idea directly to the panel at close quarters, as it were. Please be aware that tonight's event is being recorded and filmed for subsequent online publishing for use as part of the city's campaign to Rio. Now, I just ask you, as a person who's pretty much involved in the mobile media business, I know you won't turn your phones off, but just turn them to silent. But we do encourage you to use them on things like out there in the Twitterverse, and some of you may be doing that. Our hashtag tonight is EcoCity. And at Melbourne Convo, if you want to find out more about Melbourne Conversations. But please put your phones on silent so you don't disturb proceedings. Just a couple of introductory remarks from me before I introduce our first speaker. The United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, the Earth Summit in Rio in June, will be focused on, as I mentioned earlier, as one of its key themes, the green economy, in the context of poverty eradication and sustainable development. There's growing understanding that since we live on a finite planet with limited resources, it's not possible for our economy to grow forever. There's also now a substantial volume of scientific evidence that shows that economic growth, that is the continuously increasing production and consumption of goods and services, is not only environmentally unsustainable, but not improving people's lives in wealthy countries. Now, in thinking about these opening remarks, I'm reminded of the work of a fascinating guy I met once upon a time by the name of Doug Cox. Doug was a human ecologist at the CSIRO. Back in 2003, and I actually heard him speaking, I think, met him at an Environment Institute of Australia conference. He wrote a book called Deep Futures, Our Prospects for Survival. He's a human ecologist, I remind you. In the book, amongst other things of great value, he described the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and introduced what he called, at the time, 2003 or thereabouts, the 21st century 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, all back from Revelations chapter 6, verses 1 to 8, if you want to check. The original 4 horsemen of the apocalypse being pestilence, war, famine and death, or sometimes in artworks the first horseman is referred to as Christ or the Antichrist. Now, Doug's 21st century 4 horsemen of the apocalypse were world war, and by that he meant nuclear winter. The second one was global economic collapse. The third, decimating disease pandemics, AIDS, SARS, mad cow. And the fourth, convulsive climatic shifts, of which at the time he said the second, global economic collapse, is the most likely. Now, if you look back at the events since 2008, it's really quite prophetic. So with those introductory observations, and to sort of focus us on a little bit on green economy, may I introduce Professor Kate Auty. Many of you will know Kate, many won't, and I have a pleasure of sitting with Kate on her reference committee. Kate is the Commissioner for Environmental Sustainability since June 2009. She's worked in agriculture and academia, as a solicitor in her own firm and as a barrister. She was a senior lawyer for the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Victoria, Tasmania and Western Australia. That is a very, very brief introduction to Kate Auty, as all of the introductions will be tonight. But please welcome Kate to introduce herself and say a few words.
Thanks, Rob. Rob's asked us all to be brief, and he's particularly said that to me, so I'll try and do what I've been asked to do. He's also asked us to say what we feel passionate about, because this is a conversation. So I'll start by saying I'm passionate about reflecting on where we come from, who we are, what sort of people we are, and that always aligns me with the sort of acknowledgements we heard from Councillor Cathy Oak here this evening of Kulin Nation people. So I'm passionate about that. I'm also passionate about the future, and I've come here tonight with a message from Paul Briggs, who may be known to some of you here. And Paul is, of course, a Yorta person who's been very involved with the Rumballara Football Netball Club in Shepparton, which is a town that's close to me and about which I'm passionate, probably as many of you are passionate about Melbourne. And Paul asked me to make some observations that derive from his comments about the future. So Aboriginal people aren't just embarked upon a study of the past and reflecting on the past, they also think about the future, as are all of us here tonight. And Paul, of course, has submitted to the Murray-Darling Basin Authority a piece on why the River Murray is important to him. Tungala known to Aboriginal people, that's what its name is to Yorta people. And I just want to read 2 things from Paul, and then I'll talk about what I'm passionate about, and I'll keep it very brief. Paul wanted me to say that in his submission he makes this comment: the river was essentially one of our strongest elements of our social, economic and spiritual basis. He wants me also to say, as his last sentence reads, so negotiating the health and the well-being of the river is in the same breath negotiating the health and the well-being of the people who are connected with it. About the future, about the past, about reflecting where we've been and where we're going, about the Murray-Darling Basin, about the environment, about all of you, about all of us, about all of them. Now, I am passionate about participation, and I've heard a lot of people talk about Rio+20 and say, why would I waste my time going there? Why don't I want to be involved in that? It's just a gab fest. I'm passionate about participation. I'm passionate about the fact that people ought to be involved in these conversations, and we've spent some time over the last year talking to people all over Victoria. I apologise for the fact that it hasn't been all over Melbourne, but we're trying to come back to that. We've spoken to people all over Victoria about things that they concerned about, and everywhere we've been, people have said, I'm passionate about sustainability and I want to be part of the solution. We've had people talk to us under gum trees, on top of granite tours, in forests, in parks, in town halls, in council chambers, people who've come together when they've been worried about the way the rural conservation zone might play out in a particular town, have set aside their animus about that and said, we want to talk about the future and we want to talk about sustainability, and we know we need to talk to each other about that. Everywhere we've been, that's been the message. Everywhere we've been, people have said to me, if you're going to report on the environment, don't just give us dry academic science. We know we need that, we need the rigour, but you also need to know that we're important and that what we do is important, and that agriculturalists who are doing what they can to reduce their irrigation are doing something for the environment, and people who are putting the solar panels on their roofs in Corryong are doing something about the environment, and people who are bringing people together in town halls that they are reconstituting and refitting in places like Whitfield and around Wangaratta are passionate about the environment, and they're participating. They're an emblem for us. They're an emblem for what we need to do if we're going off to Rio+20, and they're an emblem for me personally, and I'm passionate about making sure that they're included in the conversations my office has.
What's your immediate task before you conclude as Commissioner?
As Commissioner, the State of the Environment report, and every 12 months we write a report about greenhouse gas emissions, and we're going to have in the next couple of weeks a report out about that participation all over Victoria, and I hope people get access to it, have a look at it. We've called it Many Publics, Participation, Inventiveness and Change, and I've specifically used inventiveness because people are a bit tired of innovation, and what we heard all over Victoria was people involved in inventive behaviour for sustainability.
Thanks, Kate. On your left, ladies and gentlemen, is Geoff Lawler. Geoff is Director of City Planning and Infrastructure at the City of Melbourne. He is a member of the City of Melbourne's corporate management team and is responsible for the performance of the City Planning and Infrastructure Division with the purpose of advising Council on city planning for the sustainable development of Melbourne. Sounds like an easy task, Geoff. Simple, read it out in a sentence. Tell us what you're on about.
Thank you, Rob, and good evening, everyone. I'd just like to put a counterpoint to Rob's rather gloomy introduction with these four horsemen of the apocalypse. I'm proud to say that I've worked for Melbourne City Council for 15 years, and I'm proud to say that through all of that time, Melbourne City Council has actually taken a very enthusiastic and optimistic view of the future of Melbourne and its society, and sustainability and sustainable development has been intrinsic to that. I'd also be a slightly perverse, and although the title of this topic is Melbourne to Rio+20, I'd actually like to go Rio to Melbourne, go back a bit. And in doing so, I'd like to acknowledge Robert Hill and the role that he's played on two critical occasions for the City of Melbourne in helping us with this enthusiasm. Because when Robert was the Federal Minister for the Environment, he facilitated local government's involvement in the pursuit of a positive response to climate change through ICLEI's CCP program. And Melbourne City Council has been the host city for ICLEI, the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, which in turn was a founding part of the Rio Earth Summit 20 years ago. And that actually got Melbourne City Council going, that program, in our response to greenhouse. More recently, in his role as recent role as chair of Low Carbon Australia, Robert has also invested directly into our 1200 buildings program, which is our current flagship program for trying to bring about energy efficiency at scale within the city. So thank you on both occasions. I think the first time that sustainability is officially recognised in the City of Melbourne's approach to planning for the future was in its what was called City Plan of 1997. And that took the view, essentially, that sustainability and sustainable development was going to be a critical hallmark of any successful city in the future. And this went along with a council and a city that wanted to actually be internationally relevant and not just a backwater. And you can remember those sentiments. In that plan, you'll find a recognition that local governments, and especially the City of Melbourne, needed to firstly do things to our own organisation to try and make it more sustainable. Secondly, seek to minimise the impacts upon the environment of the city and its operations more broadly. And then thirdly, and really importantly, to become involved in international dialogues, because these issues are international ones. And I think from that has stemmed a whole series of programs here which have all been really aimed at trying to help our community and to transform itself. And that transformation, Kate reflected on inventiveness as distinct from innovation. I actually want to introduce the word transformation, because I think transformations have always been the hallmark of economic growth, in the sense that transformation brings about inventiveness. Inventiveness brings about new jobs, new ways of doing things. But you have to get it started. And it was interesting, I think back to 1996 when that 1997 plan was being put together. The World Economic Forum in Davos, the people who were there were canvassed of what were the 5 most important things to them at that time. This was 16 years ago. And the greenhouse effect, it was called then, was in that top 5. So clearly, if Melbourne, its community, its business community, its future economy was going to be relevant, it had to actually take these things into account. And from that, the Melbourne City Council and its programs have really been about helping as best we could to make it easier for people to go down that path of transformation. That's either been through showing the way, like the construction of CH2 as a building, helping to some extent with its procurement to invest into the first wind farm in Victoria in Codrington by purchasing green power, creating financial vehicles like the Sustainable Melbourne Fund to, when no other financial investment vehicles existed, to try and stimulate sustainable activity, and more recently, with the great assistance of the Victorian Parliament, getting the world's first legislation to enable local government to link its ability to apply charges to property to the Australian financial community through the 1200 buildings program, and as I mentioned earlier, with the assistance of Low Carbon Australia, chaired by Robert Hill. So I think the note that I would like to give is that this is an important economic initiative. It's an important social initiative, and obviously it's an important environmental initiative, because cities are where over 50% of the people in the world live. It's an international thing. You can't do this logically without realising that old slogan of think global, act local. But if you do that, it actually pays off economically, because we are involved, the business community is involved in the world. We're not restricted to our own patch. I think Melbourne City Council has been fantastic in doing what it could to progress these initiatives, but I think more importantly, to hold the strategy for as long as it has, and it'll have to keep holding it for a hell of a lot longer if we're going to get to the point where we need to be, which is a society that can be admired by the world in the 21st century.
Good, Geoff, thank you. Second from your right, ladies and gentlemen, is Ellen Sandell. Ellen is the National Director of the Australian Youth Climate Coalition and one of Australia's leading commentators and campaigners on the issue of climate change. Previously, as General Manager and Victorian Director of the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, she's overseen the growth of the AYCC from a small organisation that began in 2006 to a large non-profit with 65,000 members today. Welcome, Ellen. Say a few words.
Okay. I guess I'm just going to tell a little bit about my story as being involved with international climate negotiations in the context of Rio+20 and what I think is going to happen there. So, my first involvement in the UN climate talks was back in 2007 when I went to Bali. And we were just a group of young people who just set up the AYCC. There were literally 9 of us, and we thought that we could change the world. And we thought the best way to do that wasn't just to start local or to go to the state level or to lobby our national government. We thought we'll just head straight for the UN. That's the way you do things. We've learnt differently. But so we all bought suits, these wonderful woolen suits, and we headed off to Bali where it was 35 degrees and 100% humidity. Suits were useless. And we walked into that negotiating hall. And there's 3 things that I really distinctly remember from my time in Bali. The first one was being proud to be Australian, for the first time in a little while actually, as Prime Minister Rudd signed the Kyoto Protocol and the world gave us a round of applause. And I thought, wow, this actually, what we do in Australia actually has this enormous influence on the world stage. Domestic policy actually makes a huge difference. It isn't just about what happens at the UN. And feeling really proud of that. The second thing was something that I wasn't proud of, which was that I sat in a room for over an hour where heads of state negotiated where to put a comma in a sentence. And to be honest, that's a lot of my experience of international negotiations, is people arguing over where to put commas and me sitting there and thinking, why the hell am I here? What change could I possibly make? I couldn't see a leverage point. But the third thing that I remember that sticks with me the most is meeting other young people who actually were making change, not at the international level, but actually at the local level, which is what we know needs to happen. And these were young people from all over the world, literally people from China who were risking so much to speak out, people from Malaysia putting solar panels on their school roofs, people in Japan doing bike rides across their country, and everything in between. And so many of those young people come together every year at the UN to share their ideas and organise conferences, and that's the reason why AYCC sends a delegation, is not necessarily to be involved at the conversation at a high level, but to share what we're all doing in our own countries. And I think that's the biggest challenge for me thinking about Rio+20, and it's something I haven't engaged in hugely, because the challenge for us as advocates is, how do we create a narrative around Rio that actually resonates with people back home? How do we get people involved in the conversation in a way that makes actually sense to people in their daily lives? Even myself being super involved in this, I don't see how it makes a huge amount of sense to my life. And maybe that's about creating campaigns that have national and local significance, and I can talk about that a little bit later, about the kinds of campaigns people are thinking about running around Rio. So that's really, how do we take it back from Rio, back to Melbourne and back to the places where people live. And I think the thing that I want to end with is a quote, thinking back in 1992, I think I was 7 years old, and there was a girl who was 12 years old who stood up and gave a speech at Rio that many people remember, Severn Suzuki, and she said, losing a future is not like losing a few points on the stock market. And I think that's kind of the perspective that we all need to have when we're thinking about issues like sustainable development and climate change.
Thanks, Ellen. I noticed Robert Hill smiling a little as you were explaining your observations about how to tackle international diplomacy. We might ask him for some advice later on how better to do it. Thank you for that. In the middle of our panel is Emeritus Professor Chris Wallace-Crabb, AM, who has a worldwide reputation as a poet. While his most recent books of verse include Telling a Hawk from a Handsaw and the forthcoming new and selected poems. He chairs Australian Poetry Limited, and he's a Professor Emeritus in the Australian Centre at the University of Melbourne. What's your view, Chris?
Oh, I think we're going to hell in a handsaw. Or we are going to be articulate. We are going to think. We're going to clarify our sense of responsibilities. We are going to balance what it is to be a citizen against what it is to look in the short term. I think this is crucial. I think we have to know about the past. We have to know about the present. The past is a very important part of this. We're not only looking forward to Rio, we're looking at how our metro suburban community developed and where it's going now, what things are changing. I'm old enough to have seen a whole series of changes from the days back when we were young and brash and noisy and sneered at the suburbs as though they represented something middlebrow, before realising that they were a social development of great importance, even though their full impact wasn't yet being read or understood. And there were wonderful studies like George Seddon's writing about the suburbs and the old meaning of your backyard, the little farm behind your house, where there was the firewood, maybe the chooks, the garden beds, the produced vegetables, the lemon tree, and so on. And so I connect Melbourne with thinking and writing and being clear-headed and being alert. And hence, I'm going to read a poem, which is the poem I wrote as part of Melbourne's submission, successful, to become UNESCO World City of Literature. A city. Maps of cloud move east above our heads, yearning toward the thirsty Dandenongs. We bustle down here, talking hard and think. A city of readers, I'd like to say, even inside these handheld BlackBerry years. Where sandstone rubs against a basalt plain, we built our solid warehouse on foundations of fat McSheep and gold, trickling the profits into bookshelf and blackboard. The word remained the word. Languages need our writing to survive, require a culture razzmatazz with change. Here, set on chunky stone, in rectangles where the Kulin hunters had long been roaming, we learnt to manufacture education. The word itself was British for a while. A city can be the powerhouse of ideas, prolific, plural, multitudinous. The world lives here these days in miniature, jostling, brooding, at peace. That's no small thing. Our yellow beaches feel like harmony. Much as the Yarra drifts past upside down, we take ideas and turn them over, knowing it is the opposite that's good for us, while destined for those fire-prone Dandenongs, the maps of cloud swim eastering overhead.
Lovely, Chris. Thank you very much. Our fifth panellist, ladies and gentlemen, on the far right is Professor Robert Hill. He's been mentioned a few times already for his good work. He's the National President of the United Nations of Australia, Chairman of the Carbon Trust and former Federal Minister for the Environment. Robert was a leader of the government in the Senate from March 1996 until his resignation in January 2006. In 2010, he commenced a term as Chancellor of the University of Adelaide. Robert, what's your perspective now?
Firstly, thank you for the invitation to participate. And I am actually also a supporter of participatory democracy, and I think the more the community becomes involved, the better outcome you're likely to achieve. Having said this, I'm not a pessimist, but this is a huge global challenge. The population of the world is growing, and by 2050 will be up to about 9 billion, increase from just over 7 billion. There are still many hundreds of millions of those people still basically living in poverty and have every right to lift themselves out of poverty. And the traditional way in which that's been done is to exploit natural resources. They have the right to do it in the same way as we have the right to build a standard of living that's pretty good. And you might say to me, well, now we know better, and we have, with modern science and technology, we have more choices that are open to us, and they should be able to grow their standard of living without the same depletion of natural resources as we are responsible for. But that's easy to say, but not so easy to deliver. And all of this has really happened in the last, well, it's happened really since the Industrial Revolution, when we became so efficient in extracting natural resources. Before then, it wasn't really such a threat. And anybody who's seen two huge bulldozers with a chain clearing land would know how much of the natural environment you can destroy in a very short period of time for the goal of economic growth. I disagree a bit with you, therefore, in what you said, that, or how I interpreted what you said, and that is this is really an alternative to economic growth. I think the world economy is still going to have to grow. The challenge is to try to find ways in which it can grow in a way that is less destructive of the natural resource base and produces less pollution, produces less waste. And that's been what this whole process has really been all about since Mrs. Brundtland's report on sustainable development only some 25 odd years ago. It was really only the last, she wasn't the first, but the last 30, 40, 50 years that people have started to think about this issue. Before then, it wasn't. And she started talking about intergenerational responsibility, and if we exploit, you said finite assets, if we take finite assets today, that is a loss of a future generation's natural capital, and how we should seek to take a dividend from the natural capital without taking the capital itself, which can't be replaced. And then, not long after her report, the world went to Rio 20 years ago, and the environment was pretty different. The environment was really, we're going to fix this through a whole range of international conventions and agreements. And it was really amazing, and it was a great sense of exhilaration, excitement. You know, we've found the solution. And what was amazing was how quickly these conventions were put together and the way in which consensus was achieved. You might remember President Bush Sr. at Rio saying America is strongly behind this push, it's our responsibility, you know, it's future generations, etc. And so we negotiated the Climate Change Convention in less than a year. A Biodiversity Convention was approved. An agreement, international agreement on forests was agreed. We established the Commission for Sustainable Development, which would meet in New York and bring the economic side and the environment side together and find a way in which we could exist sustainably. In the last 20 years, the challenge has been to implement that process, and we've found that the implementation is actually much harder than setting the framework. So this Rio meeting 20 years later is supposed to be a review of the progress that we've made or haven't made, and to try and chart a way forward. And what I think is that it is much harder, the challenge for this meeting is much harder than the challenge for the first meeting. Having said that, I think the focus on the green economy, which is really how you can grow an economy in a way that is less damaging to the environment, even though it's very difficult, is the correct focus.
There's some useful thinking on that now. I've been reading steady state economy, circular economy coming out of China. There's some broader thinking about how we might do that now.
Yeah. So what's supposed to come out of Rio or from Rio? It's actually they're going to allow another 3 years to do it. Nothing moves quickly at the UN.
I'm coming back to Ellen on time.
Is to develop the tools, or to collate the tools for doing this, and the tools for governments. Range from regulation to investment to public education. There's a whole range of different tools. To develop sustainability indicators so we can really see as a planet as to whether we're making progress or not, and to have a process for monitoring and reporting on those indicators so over a period of time we can see whether we're succeeding or not. And the second half is to try and build the international environmental mechanisms, UNEP that was mentioned, and the CSD, which has largely been a failure, into a body of greater clout. I think that side of it's probably not going to be as important as the first half. I think the focus on the difficult question of the green economy and how we can make it work as a global community is the challenge that should be taken up, difficult though it may be. So, I actually think, not only because I was an ambassador to the UN, that the big picture, setting the global framework, is important. But I do concede that the real work gets done at a much lower level. The outcomes are not going to be achieved through grand statements in Rio. The outcomes are going to be achieved if local communities, state communities, national communities actually do the work on the ground to make the difference. So in that light, there's two things I want to say. Firstly, despite the nice things that Geoff said, I invested in Melbourne City because it was public money. I used public money because it was showing a lead, and it did show a lead, and it is still showing a lead. And it was the first of the city councils in Australia to really get into the major built environment in cities and say, how can we encourage and support the retrofitting of energy in a more efficient way. And lastly, I wanted to give a plug for the UN Association and the Victorian Division with their Melbourne Declaration, because that is, in my language, a call to action saying that the Melbourne community and the Victorian community shouldn't just expect everybody else to be doing this, or the problem to be solved at Rio. We as a community have got to get out and make a difference ourselves. And I think that sort of attitude, if we could see it sort of replicated everywhere, might achieve a contribution to a better outcome than would otherwise be the case.
Very good, thank you for that. Let's have some conversation for about 10 or 15 minutes. Firstly to you, Ellen, is this all fast? You're the youngest here. Is this all fast enough? You went to Bali with inbuilt frustration. What have you heard tonight that encourages you about what older people think about how we might become sustainable?
Well,
Don't say nothing.
I don't know if it's because I'm young or it's just my personality, but I'm very outcomes driven and I like to get things done fast and I like to see things done fast. So things being done so slowly is really frustrating, and I think that there's a lot here that's very encouraging, but we do need to put it in the perspective of essentially we have 4 years left to solve climate change, and that's what the IPCC and these other scientific organisations are telling us, 4 years. And there is so much that's very important to talk about the green economy and sustainable development and lifting people out of poverty, and I think they're all equally important, but that scares me, 4 years.
So Geoff, you talked about time. Chris, you talked about time.
Yep.
As a physical geographer, it's one of my prime concepts. We sometimes don't get the relative scales right in terms of how we do need to respond. Some things we need to take a longer term view, but as the window becomes smaller, we've got to move more rapidly.
And can I just ask,
Sure.
how do you affect individual psychology sufficiently? How do you educate people so that Joe and Lizzie Bloggs, who are out there and their income is 10% lower than it was 5 years ago, still care intensely about the green world?
Exactly. I was going to ask, how have you responded to each other's comments?
On that point of time, I think, Ellen, this is one of the great conundrums for us, because we know we need to do stuff now. We know we haven't got time, but we know that we need to take time to do things properly. We need to involve people in what's going on, and we need to draw them into what needs to happen. And it's going to be one of the great conundrums. There's a fantastic book, it's an old book now by Pressman and Wildavsky, that talks about implementation and talks about building dreams on a foundation of ruined hopes. But nevertheless, in that book they talk about implementation, they talk about the way you get to do it and the way you position yourself forward. Time is a terror. Aboriginal Affairs has taught us that. It's one of the great parallels between Indigenous issues and the environment. How long do we wait? How long do we wait?
Let's come to something immediate. Geoff, do you want to make a comment on that? I want to ask you about programs. You have like 1,200 buildings. What's your time frame?
Oh, as soon as possible.
Well,
That's what I like to hear.
That's a wish. that's a wish. How do we actually achieve that? Because that's the time thing.
Could I offer an observation that if what we're talking about is change in human endeavour, then time really becomes a factor of individual action. So the way you compress time is by having more individuals taking action. Yep. So really, I mean, you're talking about various sort of adjectives that might be applied to economy. I think the one you didn't say, which I'd like to hope we can get to, is an intelligent economy, as distinct from the other versions you said, so that people take action in a much more knowing way about the consequences of their action, and they make choices which are positive. A positive choice can also be a way of insuring against risk, which is another, depending on which way you look at things. Going to the future is in a sense also ensuring that you're managing the risk of a bad future. But with 1,200 buildings, I mean the program seeks to bring about, ideally over about 10 years, an annual reduction in greenhouse emissions from the municipality of Melbourne of 383,000 tonnes per annum. But the thing that sells it into this positive arena and this helpful arena is that to achieve that, along the way, the city would experience a $2 billion reinvestment into itself, and potentially 8,000 new jobs could be created. And from some work that the State Department of Business and Innovation had done, that could actually stimulate in certain parts of the Victorian manufacturing sector up to a 300% increase for certain commodities, certain intelligent commodities in the business in the building arena. So I guess, depending on how you choose to position a program, if a program is simply saying no to something, well, it might achieve that but won't do anything else. If it's actually showing a new way to get to something, it brings a whole lot of positive things with it.
I think I might pursue this because Ellen's sitting there saying, that sounds great. What would you like me to make you? Would you need to be the Lord Mayor, or to make you the Premier? Or do I need to make you the Prime Minister? How do we get to this intelligent economy very quickly? I don't think anyone's disagreeing with you, but if we all just sit and wait for people to absorb it over time, I don't think Ellen's going to be very happy.
Well, I think
I'll make you the Premier.
Well, I don't want to be the Premier. I just want to be what I am, because that's the most useful contribution I can make, frankly. But I think we're at a point where a whole lot of building blocks have been put into place, and the advent of the carbon price, hopefully in a few months' time, should provide a push for people to think about these sorts of things, provided that there are sufficient attractions to go with that to cause people to see the advantage to them in making the change, then it should happen. But a whole lot of people need to talk about it. A whole lot of people need to show each other the way of doing things. A whole lot of people need to actually get up in the morning and have a go. It's
Robert,
that sort of...
the intelligent economy, is this something is this an idea we can tease out or not?
Oh yes, I think that, and I do think there's a very important role for government in this area. I mentioned regulation. If you determine an emissions level for a refrigerator, and if refrigerators are not being manufactured to meet that, somebody will do so, and you'll get a more sustainable product. Now, I've made lots of mistakes. One mistake I think I made was I was setting emission standards for motor vehicles. And I had in mind standards at a particular level, and looked at America and looked at Europe, and there were those who were arguing with me. What I was proposing was too demanding. It was that the Australian car industry wouldn't be able to support it, and so we'd lose jobs and lose an industry and lose jobs. And so we adopted a standard, which I suspect is probably still the case, of slightly less demanding than the Europeans. I think if I had stuck with my initial position, which was more demanding than the Europeans, we now might have a more sustainable car industry because we would have become leaders and made a better contribution to
Well, I have another question.
global greenhouse and possibly more jobs as well. So government regulation and setting of standards, price mechanisms are obviously important. Public education.
Well, I want to come to that because I have heard you speak before, and I do recall you saying, and this, you may consider this to be another mistake you might have made, that around about the year 2000, you were actually contemplating and discussing or exploring trading mechanisms to deal with the climate issue. Did I hear you speak about that at the Green Building Council
meeting? Very well informed. Yes, I started late 99 or something. We started the debate about potential cap and trade system for Australia, and basically, we went to industry and said, you know, if this is the way public policy is going to go, we would like you to contribute to help develop a scheme that would have the least detrimental consequence to you, on the other hand, delivering the best environmental outcome. And it was...
we haven't managed to get there.
It didn't get anywhere. It's, you know, the changes of people and changes of policy, and it basically got left in the bottom drawer. But if the process had have continued, I think we would be in a much better position than what we are today. But and that's why, you know, you've got to keep battling. If I can just have one more go, it was on this issue of 4 years we face catastrophe on climate change. What we have lost, unfortunately, and the challenge is to learn from mistakes and do better in the future. I used to have officials come to me when we were setting greenhouse gas standards, and they said, Minister, what we need, we've got to have a balance between mitigation and adaptation, you know, how you can reduce emissions and adapt to the consequences of greater emissions. And I said, I'm not going to put money into adaptation. I think that I regard it as defeatist. Well, unfortunately, it would be irresponsible now to not be putting money into adaptation, because global temperatures have risen with certain consequences. But if you're not putting money into adaptation, then people in, you know, the Bay of Bengal will drown. Yeah. So we have to adapt to the past as well as try to deliver a better outcome for the future.
Chris and Kate, this business of, I know you're eager to say something, Chris.
Well, what rhymes with regulation and adaptation is education. It's got to be part of everyone's awareness, primary school, secondary school, later education, that a part of that bundle of skills and knowledge that that child is learning is about his or her place in the planet and her or his responsibility in the planet.
And Kate, was this the thirst for participation that you're talking about?
Yeah, it is. And just on the subject of education, I mean, what we're actually seeing around the state is the children and the young people have got it. What they're saying is we need to take this home to our parents, and that's what they're doing. So I think there's a mismatch there, or it's uneven. But it is what we're seeing across the state. And I just want to come back to the intelligent economy question, because one of the sessions that we had in the Latrobe Valley, which you will all know very well, was with academics who sat around the table and talked to us about the research projects they were involved in, because they knew we would be interested in that for the State of the Environment report. But of course, also at the table was the facilities manager of the Churchill campus of Monash University. And it was a revelation to all of the researchers when he started to talk about his work, and I could see them all thinking to themselves, I wish I'd known that, because Monash Churchill had set itself a target. They'd said we want to reduce greenhouse emissions, and they'd bested that target in the time that they'd set the target. And in besting the target, they'd saved themselves $600,000, which they were perfectly capable of demonstrating. So here were these researchers sitting around the table thinking to themselves, the co-benefit for me might have been some research assistance for my project about koala DNA. I mean, everything is connected. It's all connected. And here was a university table of scholars and the facilities manager seemingly having that conversation about the unevenness of understanding the co-benefits and getting to an intelligent green economy in a place such as the Latrobe Valley.
Now, just about 60 seconds each. We've got to wrap up this part of the panel. We'll get a little break, introduce our say, come back. You'll have plenty more time to make other points you want to make. Robert, you're enthusiastic about Rio. You think there's an opportunity there that we need to go into strongly.
Well, I think it's important. I wouldn't say I'm enthusiastic.
Okay. It's important that we be there.
I wouldn't want to overestimate the outcomes of Rio, but I think it is important as a global community to review the last 20 years, what's been achieved and what hasn't, and at least as a global community commit ourselves to do better in the future, and more importantly to start developing the tools that might more effectively get us to those goals.
And Ellen, from you, just a concluding remark.
I think for me, there's a lot of goodwill around here. There's a lot of great conversations. We say things like education needs to happen. All these principles are really good, but for me it's about action, and it's about what are we going to do about it. If we care about education, maybe we should be talking to the federal government about why sustainability isn't one of the key principles in their national curriculum. Maybe we should go to Martin Ferguson and be saying, why is your energy white paper full of coal and gas and says that renewables don't need any more help? So it's about, there are a lot of perverse things happening out there, a lot of perverse incentives. We all have this will to create the green economy, which is fantastic, but there's a lot of people out there who are doing things that are actively working against it, and I think we need to be aware of that, and also our role in playing a part of making sure that that doesn't happen again.
Chris, a quick wrap up.
Trees are green. We should all be planting trees. Even if you live in an apartment, there's somewhere you can plant a tree. And all my life I've planted far more trees than I've ever cut down.
That's good action. Kate?
We held a meeting in Maryborough with 40-50 women, rural women leading change, and at the end of it a woman put her hand up and I thought, oh no, we're now in trouble because this is the climate denialist. It wasn't. It was a woman who said, this is the best meeting I've ever been to and I'm very glad I was here. Not every time we go to a Rio are people going to say that, but some will. And Ellen talked about sharing and about sparks, and I think we need sparks.
Before coming down here, I went back and had a look at a 1997 document, and in it there was a quote about the international agreement of the time, and there were something like 600 particular actions that had to be pursued, and 400 of those were within the sphere of local government. So my point is, local government actually matters a lot in this space. As a humble public servant, ideally it'd be nice to have joined up government on these topics, but if nothing else, local government has to keep going and doing things.
As it is, yes. Yeah, good. Yes. Now, we're just going to have a word from one of our sponsors, indeed. A little bit of an ad break, as it were. May I introduce to you A.L. Hallamish to talk to us about Our Say. And this is where you start to get engaged as an audience, and we have a broader capacity for you to ask questions on indeed a wider stage. But A.L.'s going to tell us about it.
Thank you very much, Rob. This is the interactive part, so I need your help on this one. By a show of hands, how many of you are going to the Rio summit in June?
Can anybody go?
Even on stage? On stage?
In a hotel room.
We got a few. Okay, well, how many of you have an issue that you want to see world leaders at Rio address? Beautiful, we got a few more in there. Just a few. All right, we're going to get even more interactive. I want everybody in the room to stand up. Stand up. Now, I want you to think about an issue. Think about an issue that keeps you up at night. One of those issues that you want to see those world leaders at Rio address. Something that burns inside of you, you're thinking about it, you can't sleep because that issue isn't being addressed, and it's one that you want to see them change. Think about that issue. Think about it for a good couple seconds. Now, when I count to 3, I want every single person in the room to say that issue out loud. Think about that issue. 1, 2, 3. Amazing. Everyone sit down. Now, imagine if we could take every single one of those issues and connect you with other people who care about those issues and present them to the leaders at Rio. Right now, we have that opportunity. That's the reason a group of young people from Melbourne decided to build something called RSay. RSay is an online and offline organization that allows people to write down the issues they care about, write down the questions they care about, mobilize their friends and family using social media such as Facebook and Twitter, or even going to a pub with a laptop and asking people to vote for your question. And we then take the top questions and we pose them to major decision makers, to leaders in Rio. And Councillor Cathy Oak has agreed to, 1 month from now, take the top 5 question askers on RSA and meet with them and understand their stories and understand why they care about these issues and capture your stories on video and take that to the world stage at Rio. So we have a number of people set up around, just up the stairs, and as you go and grab a drink or as you stretch your legs like I allowed you to just do, make sure you register on the website, you post a question about an issue you care about, and invite your friends and family when you get home tonight, or even ask people in the room here tonight to vote for your question. Every person gets 7 votes, and you can allocate those votes to whichever questions you'd like. And in 1 month, the top 5 question askers will have the opportunity to have their stories and their ideas told. So let's not make this Rio summit kind of like the last one, where it was a summit about nothing. Let's make it about something. Let's make it about something that you care about. And log on to RSA and make it happen. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Al.